Muted.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for a refresher training on time task analysis. For all of us who have used this system before, an online meeting, you know that it can be kind of difficult sometimes to hear each other. I would ask that if you are listening on your computer and also on your phone at the same time, that you turn off the speakers for your computer so you don't have the feedback. Right now what we're going to do is we're going to spend the next hour or so doing a refresher of time task analysis and how we do this effectively. On your screen right now you should see a blue screen that says SAM's time task analysis and refresher. And we're going to move through just a quick review of where we are as a national project. Currently we have 365 participating schools in 66 districts. There are 14 states and the District of Columbia that participate currently. And there's North Carolina, our 14th state. We're in 3 races of the top states, with Delaware being the largest implementation of SAMs. And the Iowa governor included in his blueprint for reform 2 weeks ago a proposal that the legislature pay to put SAMs in every Iowa school. So SAMs has definitely caught on. We have 2 independent evaluations that prove the process works. The national program is in place, and we will be an independent organization starting July 1st of 2012. We use a fee-for-service structure, and we took in more in revenue last year than we had the year prior from Wallace when we were on grant funds, and this year we're more than doubled that. So we're doing okay. SAM is a process, and as a data collector, you play a very important role. As a process, the first step is readiness, and that's a session where the school begins thinking about what it would be like if the principal spent more time engaged in instructional leadership. Second step is collecting baseline data, and that's where you come in. This baseline data is how the principal knows where they're starting from, because they want to have something to work against. And so having that baseline data where you go in and collect what the principal is doing every 5 minutes for 3 to 5 days is of real value to the principal. Having it collected consistently is important too, so we make sure that it is believable for the principal and useful. The next step is the principal begins using Time Track, a software program, and having a daily meeting to talk about, am I scheduling at or above goal each day? Are the kinds of events I'm scheduling likely to change my practice and also improve teacher practice? And then a time change coach comes in monthly or more often, particularly in our newer sites. We do this much more often than once a month. And then a year later, the data collector, you, comes back, and that way the principal has a before and after picture of how they're doing. In terms of research, we know that SAMs does work. There is a change of practice. We know the change is significant. We know there's no other thing in terms of professional development for principals you can say that about, that there's proof that it actually works. Yesterday, the Wallace Foundation released a new piece of research. This research is of real value to us because it shows that the gain that principals are averaging in their first year is pretty extraordinary. It equates 27 extra days of instructional leadership time. Essentially an extra day per week. The other thing that's kind of impressive is that the longer the principal participates in this practice or process, the bigger gain that they have. By the 3rd year, the average SAM principal has added the equivalent of 55 extra days of instructional leadership time for that year. And this piece is very important to us because it shows that the research is very clear now that Model 3 SAM schools, and that's where a principal uses an existing staff member as the SAM, shows the same gain in time as Model 1 SAM schools over time. And so that's all good news for the kind of work SAM principal teams are doing around the country. One thing we push the principal about pretty hard, and the SAM as well, is simply changing your time isn't adequate. You need to change it and then examine, is it improving teacher practice? Is it increasing student engagement? Is it increasing parent engagement? Because those 3 lead to student achievement gain. The big one there, of course, is improving teacher practice, and that's the biggest lever that the principal has. So time task analysis is important to us because it is the key for this process. Without this, the principal would not know whether or not they're making a gain or not. Otherwise, it would just be kind of a guessing game, really. With time task analysis, having you go into the school, observe the principal, watch what they're doing, and every 5 minutes make a decision as to whether or not they're engaged in something that's primarily instructional, primarily managerial, or primarily personal is really important for us because that gives the principal data that they can use. Originally, when we started SAMS in 2002, we did the time task analysis for 5 days every 5 minutes. Research has shown us that we can do it for 2 or 3 days as an option and statistically get reliable data. In most sites, we're still doing it 5 days, but in some sites, we have reduced to 3, depending on what the school or the district wishes to do. So the first thing that the data collector has to do is make a decision as to whether what they're seeing the principal doing at one particular moment in time when the stopwatch hits 5 minutes, is that activity primarily instructional, primarily managerial, or primarily personal. And so I'm going to stop for a minute, and I am going to open
Unmuted.
phones, and I'm going to ask Brenda Maynard. Brenda, what do you think? How do you make this decision?
Pardon me?
How would you make the decision as to whether what the principal is doing is primarily instructional, management, or personal?
I'm sorry, Mark. I can't hear you.
Sounds like we're getting quite a bit of feedback. If you have an ability to put your phone on mute, please do so right now, except for Brenda Maynard. All righty. Brenda, if you had to make a decision as to when you're watching the principal as to what they're doing, you have to decide if it's instructional, management, or personal. How do you make that decision?
Well, Mark, I think you make the decision based on exactly what the principal is doing at that time.
I think what I heard you say
Muted.
that you have to make the decision based on what you're actually seeing. Your default position is always that what you're seeing is managerial, so it's going to be management, unless you have evidence otherwise. And so when I'm watching a principal in action and the stopwatch has hit the 5-minute mark, what I'm asking myself is, do I see evidence that this is instructional or personal? If not, then it's going to be management. So my default position is what I'm seeing is always management unless I have evidence otherwise. So evidence otherwise is pretty easy to quantify because what you're looking for evidence is something that would indicate that CIA, curriculum instruction or assessment, is evident in what the principal's doing for it to be instructional. So anytime I see a principal working, I assume that what I'm seeing is management unless I see evidence otherwise. And so anything that has CI in it, curriculum, instruction, or assessment, I am going to then go from my default position of 1, management, to 2, instruction. Questions or comments before we continue? I'm going to
Unmuted.
questions or comments before we continue? All righty, we're still getting lots of feedback, but that's okay. We'll go ahead and see if we can continue. So the CIA is real important because that's the evidence I have to know that what I'm seeing is not going to be management, but instead is instructional. Personal is anything that is personal to the principal. And so principal having to call home to check about what needs to be picked up on the way home, checking about a personal appointment, those things are personal to the principal, and so that gets coded as personal. So every 5 minutes, the data collector is making a decision on category. It's either going to be 1, management, 2, instruction, 3, personal. Default is always management unless you have evidence otherwise. So management descriptors. First one, student supervision. Student supervision is any time the principal is supervising a child, but there's no CIA involved. And so it may be in a cafeteria, it might be out at the bus stop. The principal may also be just talking with the student about behavior, but not suggesting a consequence. In that case, we'd list it as student supervision management. Student discipline is whenever there's a consequence implied or suggested. Employee supervision has an interesting definition, and this may be a little bit new for some of you because it's been tweaked just a little bit over time. Employee supervision is whenever the principal is telling the staff member what to do and CIA isn't present. You also use this code for the personal conversations a principal might have with staff members. So if a principal asks staff member Rick Delagardelle, "Hey Rick, what do you think of the Cardinal game last night?" that conversation would get coded as one management C employee supervision. This is a particular descriptor that we have not been as clear on in the past, and one of the reasons we wanted to do the refresher today. Employee discipline is any time the employee receives a warning from the principal, again, where CIA is not present because we're just talking about management descriptors. Office work prep is any work the principal is doing in the office, but again, CIA is not present. Building management. This is kind of an unusual descriptor because it attempts to grab all the time the principal uses dealing with custodial and maintenance issues in the building. Parents and guardians. Anytime a parent or guardian is taking the principal's time, and again, CIA is not present. Decision-making groups and meetings. Anytime the principal is engaged in a meeting where a decision is clearly going to be made or they're discussing a decision. Sometimes when the principal asks for input, that would be a key that this would be a decision-making group or meeting. And again, for all the management descriptors, the missing element is CIA. CIA is not present. Descriptor I, district, meetings and supervisors, anytime that the district is taking the time of the principal. External, anytime an external official, might be someone from social services, might be the fire marshal, is taking the principal's time, and CIA is not present. And then finally, for the last descriptor under management, celebration, this is when the principal is choosing to celebrate something that does not have CIA as its piece or core. So I might say, happy birthday, Dave. Congratulations. I understand you are 35 today. That would be an example of a management celebration descriptor. So before we move on, questions or comments about the management descriptors, and I'm going to take everybody's microphones and phones off mute. Are you there? Questions or comments about the management descriptors?
I think this is a much clearer explanation of the employee supervision.
It does make it easier, doesn't it, for employee supervision to know that that's what you're going to code when the principal is having a friendly conversation with a staff member, but there is nothing there that indicates that it has anything really to do with school. And in no way is that a bad thing. You want a principal to build relationships that are positive with staff members, and so having those kinds of conversations are good. And so we tried to be a little bit clearer about where you code that, and that's where we're coding in employee supervision.
On the training, I have written beside celebration, principals doing relationship building activities. Now, is that no longer in K? Does that now belong up in C? Because those kind of conversations about football or whatever could certainly go under principal building relationship activities. So I'm just clarifying that. It sounds as if we don't want that under K anymore. We'll put it up under C. Is that right?
See, that's a really good point. That was one of the confusing elements we had before, and we've tried to make it a little bit clearer here. We would say that the difference would be entirely in tone and how it's presented. For example, if the principal high-fives another teacher and says, "Can you believe the Cards won last night? That was great," that's going to get listed as celebration, management celebration. But if they're just talking about, say, for example, a political issue, or they might be talking about the game, but they're not clearly celebrating, then we're going to say it's under employee supervision. The reason we added celebration as a descriptor in the first place is we had principals and data collectors, too, say that it really didn't show up anywhere in the descriptors. So really what celebration has normally been has been where you can show the principal is making a point to celebrate something that's occurring in the school, management or instructional.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I believe that was D.
Yes.
All righty, all righty. Okay, any other questions or comments about the management descriptors before we move on? All right, I'm going to go ahead.
Could I ask one more little dumb question?
Absolutely.
This is going to be so literal, and I apologize to people. Under office prep work, I notice once in a while, the principal leaves the office and might be on their way to observe, or they might be on their way to grab something and come back. And so it's kind of like they're in between two clear activities. They're en route. And I'm not always sure. It's not always real clear what that should be. Because sometimes you don't know they're going to observe until a few seconds later when they're in the room observing. And sometimes they're just out and about, and they don't end up talking to somebody, and they just come back. That kind of thing I've been doing is office prep management.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes, like they've been in one room, and then they switch activities, then they're en route. Sometimes that's about the only thing that's still tricky for me.
And that can be a tough one when the principal is moving from one place in the building to another. Oftentimes I'll get listed as management student supervision because the principal is in a hallway and there are students present, and so that's going to be the logical descriptor.
Right.
One of the reasons that we require pretty much 100% accuracy on the category is that's pretty clear cut. You can clearly delineate between something that's management, instruction, or personal. Whether or not CIA is present is clear and pretty easy to determine. With the descriptors, there is a lot of overlap between descriptors, and so what we look for is as a great degree of accuracy as we can, but we realize this is an artificial system, and you're not going to be able to be completely accurate on every one of these.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments before we move on?
Say, Mark.
Go right ahead.
This is Rick Delagardelle.
Hello there, Rick. How are you?
Good, thank you. I was wondering, it's my assumption that just because an external person may be at a meeting, it does not necessarily make it an external coding. What's been driving my decision-making there would be if the external person is a main participant, perhaps even setting the agenda, versus an observer. Is that pretty much on target?
That's absolutely on target, and it kind of gets to the point that it's not what the principal intends for the meeting to be, it's what's actually happening. And so if an external official, let's say a fire marshal, was sitting at a table and there were 5 other people at the table and the conversation revolved around a construction project and it was all district officials and there was a district person leading the meeting, then you would list that as district meeting supervisors or decision-making groups and meetings, depending on what was happening at the time. One of the things that is nice about this system is it isn't lockstep. You really are making your decision as to how you code based on what is actually happening. Does that help, Rick?
That's right on. That's very good. Thank you.
All righty. I'm going to move on to instructional descriptors. The instructional descriptors are, I think, also pretty straightforward. There is also a lot of overlap, though, between the descriptors, and we'll talk a bit about that. Student supervision is when the principal is using proximity or is actually talking with the student in a classroom and asking the student to pay attention. It's a principal activity where the principal is helping the student become more engaged of what's occurring. It doesn't switch to work with students unless the principal is actually talking with the student about content. And so if I am talking to student Jim, and I say to Jim, Jim, I need you to put your eyes on the teacher, put your tech away, pay attention to the teacher right now. That's going to get listed as instructional student supervision because I'm redirecting the student. But then if I say to Jim, Jim, talk to me about how you're multiplying by the second digit. I don't quite understand your logic here. Show me what you're doing. Then it becomes work with students instead. Employee supervision under instruction is a very specific kind of feedback. It is a directive feedback where the principal is saying to the teacher that they have an expectation of something. So for example, I might say to teacher Ellen, I enjoyed being in your classroom. I was a little concerned that I didn't see the objective on the board. I want to make sure that kids understand what your expectations are for what they're to learn. I want to see the objective on the board. When I come back in this afternoon, make sure that's there, all right? Well, that's clearly a direction, and so it becomes employee supervision. It's a kind of feedback. Now, we are finding that this is more and more of import to principals to be able to delineate what kind of feedback they give. And so we see with principals now using their time track calendars to move their instructional percentage up, there's a real focus not only on having feedback, but having a mix of feedback. Feedback sessions that are C, employee supervision, and also feedback that deals with non-directed conversation, which we'll see in just a minute. D, office work prep. This is just like office work prep under management, except there's something else there. What's there, Rick, that's not under the management office work prep?
Well, that would be the CIA. The work is either focused on curriculum, instruction, or assessment.
Yep, there's some CIA there. And so when that occurs, then we would list it as office work prep instructional. So an example of that might be the principal is sitting at his or her desk and looking at test scores. We'd list that as instructional office work prep because the A in CIA is present, assessment. Observation walkthrough is when the principal is observing in a classroom or walking through a classroom observing. Now, this descriptor is both observation and walkthrough for a data collector, but a principal and their SAM team use these as two separate descriptors. Anybody have an idea of why? Any thought on why a data collector just has one descriptor where observation and walkthrough are listed together, but on time track they're separated out for the SAM and principal?
Hello, Rick. Hello, Mark. This is Ron Steinheimer.
Hi, Rick.
My phone connection is not too good, but a walkthrough would be probably brief and just going through without taking notes, and observation would be more formal and probably more lengthy for note-taking and expected feedback and part of the evaluation.
Yeah, the reason it's for the data collector, we combine them, is when you're data collecting, you don't know how long the principal is going to be staying. Whereas the SAM may say to the principal, would you like to go in and do a 30-minute observation versus a walkthrough where you're going to be there for 5 or 10 minutes. And so for a data collector, if the principal is in a classroom and they appear to be observing instruction, then you use the descriptor E, observation walkthrough. Feedback to teacher, that goes up with employee supervision. This kind of feedback, though, is non-directive, and so it might sound like this. I was in your classroom. Help me understand how kids know what to expect in terms of what you want them to learn by the end of the hour. How would they know that? So I'm engaging the teacher in a conversation about how kids would know what the expectation is instead of giving a direction. Real important to be able to identify C, employee supervision, from F, feedback to teacher. Comments or questions before we continue?
Yes, Mark, I have a question. This is Ron Steiner again. We observe teacher or the principal writing a note back to the teacher after an observation. Sometimes it's in the classroom and they'll leave it on the desk, or sometimes they'll put it in the mailbox. We know that it's feedback. It's usually a brief note, so I'm assuming that that would be a general coding of F for feedback because we don't know specific content to label it as a directive or expectation.
It's a real interesting issue, and the way we actually would code that would be instruction, D, office work prep, because if at the 5-minute mark what the principal is doing is writing what he intends to be feedback when the teacher actually reads it, well, the actual writing of it's going to be listed as instructional office work prep. You can use D, office work prep, for things that are not happening in the office. So the feedback, whether it be employee supervision or feedback to teacher, has to be live. It can't be something that the principal is intending for the teacher to read. It has to be something they're actually interacting about. That makes sense?
Okay. It's sometimes it's difficult because they're, you know, the principal's actually in the room and leaving it where the teacher can see it, and the teacher is told that it's on the desk. Pretty much, you know, I've left you some information. Does that make it more direct?
Well, if you were right at the 5-minute mark and the principal turns to the teacher and says, "I've left you feedback on your desk," then yeah, you could list it as feedback because at least there's some conversation happening there. But really, there's nothing wrong with office work prep as an instructional activity. What we do know about feedback is that written feedback has value, but if you put it on a continuum, it's on the very low end of the continuum. Why? Because there's not interaction. You don't know if the teacher's read it. You don't know if the teacher understood it. You don't know if the teacher had questions. And so one of the things we push SAM principals about pretty hard is make sure for every time you do a walkthrough or you do an observation that the feedback is clear, that there's a connection there. And so many SAMs now will make a point of scheduling feedback times with teachers after a walkthrough or an observation for that very purpose. Oftentimes, the principal, the SAM will say to the principal, "You observed Mark yesterday. Did you want an employee supervision session with him or a feedback session with him?" And then if the principal says, "No, I don't need either one," we tell the SAM to ask, "Well, why did you do the observation then? What's the point?" Because the research is pretty clear that there's no connection to teacher change without feedback, in this case feedback and employee supervision. Although there is feedback in other areas in some of these other descriptors, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Any other questions before we move on?
This is Dave Brown, Mark.
Hey, Dave, how are you?
I'm good. I was just looking at that feedback, and I think the critical attribute of that one, and the coding is driven by the one-on-one personal interaction, and I think the reason for that is that it's so much more powerful than a written note or anything else when they have one-on-one personal interaction with each other.
It's not only more powerful, it's the only time you as the data collector know that the feedback has actually been received, whether it be feedback that's non-directive F or feedback that's directive employee supervision C. Interestingly enough, though, there's a more powerful kind of feedback that we're going to see in the descriptors as we continue here in a minute. But I heard another voice, another question or comment.
This is Dee. I just, if I could go back a little bit to the office work prep. If a principal is, because I saw a lot of this, you know, at the beginning of the year, they had teachers, meetings with teachers about where to place students based on test scores, what reading groups, and that kind of thing. And then they are actually sitting at their computer working with the groups, moving them around and so forth. There's CIA present in the sense that it's based on scores in their curriculum groups. On the other hand, it can also be seen just as a management thing. We've got to get so many kids in this room with this teacher.
Keep in mind that there's management in everything a principal does, and there's also instruction in everything a principal does. What we're looking at here is what is it primarily. And so what you describe, a principal working with a group of people to determine student placement in classes based on test scores, is clearly instructional.
Right, but I'm talking about more when he or she goes back to the office and starts, you know, manipulating the groups, say, in a database or scheduling.
Again, since you see what the principal's doing and why, you have evidence that CIA is there, it would be instructional office work prep. There's many things the principal's going to do in an office that will have CIA, and that's a good example.
Okay. I just want to make sure that I was seeing that correctly. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions or comments before we move on? All righty. We have several written comments I want to address. Let's see. One person says, if what you're seeing, everything you see is management unless you see evidence otherwise. That's correct. Your default position is always that the category is going to be management unless you see evidence otherwise. The next one was a thank you for clarification about employee supervision. And then, building relationships is part of management when not dealing with CIA. That's correct. And so it's going to be a management activity, building relationships, and it's going to be coded under employee supervision, unless you're congratulating someone, and then it's going to be under celebration. Feedback, one-on-one, more effective. Written feedback left to interpretation. And again, I don't want to sound negative about written feedback. I think it's very valuable. I was working with a principal in Fort Wayne, Indiana the other day that uses his written feedback, and his Sam uses it with him to determine who he's going to be meeting with 3 times a week, where he has group meetings with teachers to talk about particular instructional issues. That's a very good use of the written feedback, and then leveraging it into a group meeting where you're going to have it have far more impact. And I think those are all the written questions I see online. Continuing, parents and guardians, that's any conversation you have with a parent or guardian as a principal where CIA is present.
I'd like to hear this.
The parent who is upset because they didn't receive a thorough work notice and got the report card, and it was the first time they realized there was a problem. There's assessment there, so that would be kind of an instructional conversation. It would be coded as G, parents and guardians. And let's see if we can get our tech to work. Decision-making groups and meetings. This, just like under management, is any time there's a group that the principal is part of, and it appears a decision is either in the making or the principal is asked for input. If that occurs, then we would
Muted.
that as decision-making groups or meetings. Also, if the principal appears to be asking for input, we'd also list that as decision-making groups or meetings. And what we'd be looking for here was anything that dealt with CIA. District, meetings and supervisors. Anytime a district person, excuse me, and it could be the superintendent, it could be the secretary at the district office. Anytime they're taking the principal's time and CIA is involved, then it's going to be listed as district, meeting, supervisor. External, anytime an external official, a state person, for example, or could be someone from the Kiwanis Club, is taking the principal's time and instruction, curriculum, or assessment CIA is being discussed, that's where you're going to code it. Teaching and modeling. This is an important descriptor because it's another way a principal could give feedback. And teaching and modeling is when the principal uses this opportunity to teach as a way of modeling for a teacher. And so if the teacher was having a very hard time with grouping in a classroom and the principal went in and taught a lesson and then grouped as an example for the teacher, that would be listed as instructional, teaching, and modeling. And this one, professional development, is a key piece because many principals will give feedback through professional development. So, for example, a principal from his walkthroughs using the written data, for example, that he's left for principals' feedback, may realize that there's a common thread that a group of teachers could benefit from a PD session. And it might be differentiating instruction. And so he may do then a professional development session specifically based on those experiences. And so again, that would be another kind of feedback. And then this is the biggest one, really, planning, curriculum, and assessment. The most effective principals will make a point of making sure that their feedback is given individually, but also given in a group setting. For example, a principal might go into a professional learning community of, say, the science teachers at a high school, sit down, listen, participate in the meeting for a few minutes, and then say, hey, before I leave, just wanted to share something. I've seen a lot of really interesting practice in some of your classrooms during the last week where you are tying what you're teaching to what's happening in the social studies department. I'm really impressed by that, and I'd really encourage you to do more of that. And then the principal exits. Well, you know what those teachers then talk about. Well, who did that? Who did he see? What was he talking about? Many principals use these kinds of meetings for leverage to get the kind of change they're looking to see. And last but not least is celebration as an instructional descriptor. This is one that probably more SAMs and principals pick as something they want to work on than anything else, and you can understand why. The research is pretty clear that if a principal can celebrate the good work that a teacher is doing, that a student is doing, that a parent is doing, tied to CIA, you get huge benefit. I am going to
Unmuted.
the microphones again and see what questions or comments we have. Questions or comments? Looks like Janet Starr.
No, I'm just looking at my screen, so I don't have any comments.
All right. Any questions or comments before we move on? All right. Interaction is the easiest one, and that's the last thing you code at the end of 5 minutes. And you are coding what the principal is doing
Muted.
in terms of how they're doing it. And so are they doing it on the telephone? Are they doing it on a computer? Are they working with an individual? Are they working with a group? Or are they read, write, thinking? Question
Unmuted.
about that?
Mark, Marilyn.
Hello?
Okay, go right ahead.
Okay.
Mark, this is Marilyn from Iowa City, and more and more principals are using smartphones and for both their code for taking notes in the classroom and just in general use. Do we code those as computers since they are internet connected, or they no longer really are in essence telephones?
Isn't tech great? And look how the tech has changed over our life. The way you described it, it would definitely be computer. If the principal was using the smartphone to have a two-way conversation, then it would be telephone. If they were using the smartphone to do as you described, to enter data or to send a message, then it's going to be computer.
That's a good description. Very good. Thank you.
Other questions or comments about interactions?
Yes, Barbara Wade.
Hi, Barbara.
How are you?
I am well. How are things in Chicago?
Fine, fine. The last speaker touched on what I was thinking because the principal that I shadowed last week used a BlackBerry. And he would take all his notes from his BlackBerry and then send an email to the teacher. He didn't really use the computer, but I coded it as computer because it was technology.
The way you described it, if I understood you correctly, it definitely would be computer, and so that's fine.
Okay.
Very good. Anyone else before we move on? All righty. Scenarios. Let's see what we think on a couple of these. Who wants to give it a shot? What's the category here?
Without evidence of CIA, it's 1.
That sounded like Dave in Iowa. You're absolutely right. It definitely is 1, and it is management because I don't have evidence of CIA. Anybody disagree? Great. What descriptor do you think fits best for memory?
And the E for office.
E for office. And what would be the interaction?
5 for thinking.
All righty. And we will see if we are right, and we are 1E5. Okay, let's see if we can do another one. Principal Sally's walking a 3rd grade student to class after the tardy bell. What is the category here?
That would be a 1, Mark.
Okay, and the descriptor?
Be an A for supervision and a 3.
And a 3, let's see if you're right, and you absolutely are. 1 for management, A for student supervision, 3 for interaction with an individual. Let's change it up a little bit. Can somebody else give me the category for this?
It'd still be a 1.
Okay, and what's the descriptor?
B for student discipline.
Excellent, and the interaction? And there we are, 1B3. Very good. Management, because there's an absence of CIA. B for student discipline, and 3 for interaction with an individual. I think we need to be harder here. Let's try a harder one here. And can I have someone new tell me what the category is here? Dee, what do you think?
It's instructional because he is in the classroom, and that's kind of what I had in my notes. And it would be E for observation, and it would be 5 for think, write, read, write, or think.
Let's see if D is right. And I think you already know, because that was just perfect. 2E5. Very good, D. Principal Concepcion is talking with the teacher about student engagement and asked her to try a new technique. Barbara Wade, what do you think?
2 for instruction, and principal is giving direction. That's for C2, C3.
All righty, and Barbara, I agree with you. Let's see if the computer does too. Oh, good, it does. Instruction, and then it's direction, so it's going to be employee supervision, 3 with an individual. And let's look at this one. Principal Sally is on the phone with the district administrator talking about a budget issue. Sheila, what do you think? Janet Starr, what do you think? How about Marcia? Ron, what do you think?
Hello. I would say that would be 1, management, and I, and telephone, 1.
Yep, 1I1. Very good, very good. Now, this particular scenario was emailed to me today from Marcia. Marcia, if you're on the phone, can you talk to us about this? I think Marcia is listening but not able to talk. I'm not sure she has a speaker. Marcia, if you can, go ahead and tell us. And while we're waiting, we'll let everybody read this. So, first question on this, is this management or is it instructional? And I'll take anyone.
Mark, I would say it's instructional.
I would too.
Yeah, there's definitely CIA present. And so since there's CIA present, it's an instructional event. Now, for the descriptor, what do you think fits?
It's observation.
I think it might be D. Just
Working with students.
You know, we have several possibilities. It kind of depends on what the principal's really typing, doesn't it? If the principal's typing a comment to the class, then it would be work with students. If the principal is just observing, then it's going to be observation walkthrough. And if the principal gave a direction to the teacher, then it would be employee supervision. I really love this scenario. I appreciate Marcia submitting it because it's pretty interesting, and it's a real-life one that she dealt with recently. And I do have a note here from her that she does not have a phone to actually speak, but she's able to hear over the computer. And it looks like we have several people who are in that same situation today. All right. Let's continue with scenarios. And I'll take anybody.
Well, under the refined definition, that would be management, teacher supervision, and probably 3 for interaction with others.
That's absolutely right. It would be definitely a management conversation. It's C, employee supervision, and 3, interaction with an individual. How about this one? Principal Paul is asking the teacher how he decides to change direction during a lesson.
That would be an instructional piece and feedback.
I think I heard you say feedback, and I think that was Rick Delagardelle. Let's see. 2, instruction, F, feedback, 3, interaction with an individual. Principal Sally is meeting with the science community. They're discussing use of test data to drive question is, what's the category?
CIA.
Yeah, definitely instruction because CIA is present. What's the descriptor?
Test data would be M.
Planning, curriculum, and assessment. And the interaction?
4.
4 with a group. Very good. Very good. All righty. I'm going to move on just a bit and talk about protocol. But before we do that, let me see if we have any questions about the basics of doing data collection, time task analysis. Any questions or comments before we move on to protocol?
Mark, I have a scenario that I'd like your feedback on.
All right.
The principal was working in a small room with the counselor, and they were listing on the wall all the reading groups of all the kids with all the names on cards and grouping them, and in some cases talking about kids, and in some cases just transferring lists of kids to cards on the wall. And so there was some management just, copying one thing to the next, but there was also some content talk. But it was all kind of related, well, it was all related to reading and using assessment data. They were all using assessment scores to group these kids. And I found myself going in and out and in and out. Does that sound about right?
When you say you found yourself going in and out, do you mean that once you code it management, then the next time you might code it instructional?
Well, yeah, I question myself because the setting was really CIA, where they were using assessment data, so that's CIA. But from time to time, they would just use lists and just making piles of cards. So I question myself on whether or not I should go to management for those few times that happened.
Well, once again, everything a principal is going to do instructionally is going to have an element of management and vice versa. The question has to become, what's the primary purpose here? And the primary purpose is to group these students, and the principal is clearly using assessment data to do so. So the management piece of that instructional activity, the moving of the cards from one place to another, might make you think, well, I'm going to put management because I don't see CIA. But the trouble is you do see CIA because you know that that's the purpose here, that is what the group is working on. There may be times during a meeting that you're going to code something that's management and then switch back to instruction at the next 5-minute mark, because what they're doing is truly just management. And so if they are talking about, do we want to use the yellow cards or the green cards for this activity of grouping these students, I'm going to code that as management. But if they are talking about which student should go in which pile, which group, then I'm going to list it as instruction. Does that make sense to you, Dave?
That makes a lot of sense. That's pretty much, that is, and not pretty much, it is what I decided, because I was looking at, am I looking at just logistics here, or am I looking at something that the principal and their expertise and the council and their expertise in instructional matters are needed here? And one of the questions I asked myself is, could a secretary do this, or could a school administrator manager do this? And I decided absolutely not. They needed the principal and the counselor to do this activity. So the intent of the whole thing was CIA. So I found myself, doing what you just said.
All righty. Other comments about Dave's scenario? All righty. Anyone else have another scenario they'd like to discuss before we move on to protocol?
I have one that it's high school, and the principal is walking past an assistant principal's office, looks in, and goes in. And in that office, there's the police liaison, the assistant principal, and a student. And they are looking at videotapes of the bus and having the usual discussion. The principal goes in, stands and observes, says nothing for about 2 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes, and then leaves without saying anything. But the coding comes up while he's standing there.
Great. What were they talking about? The police, the student, and the AP?
It was, the student was, there was some evidence that he was using drugs on the bus.
All righty. So do we see any CIA in this situation?
No, I see it clearly as a 1.
Okay, so it's definitely 1, management. What descriptor did you pick?
I went back and forth on that one so much. I'm not sure 100%. But I think second, let me flip back to the descriptors.
I'm going to pull it up for you right now. See if it'll come up on my computer for me. I love tech when it works. Here it comes. All right.
I think I might have ended up with well, I'm really not sure. I'm thinking I ended up with, no, he didn't give any directions.
Let me ask you a
I
different
can't
question.
remember.
What are the possibilities to you? What descriptors kind of stick out and say, hey, this might be right?
Well, I think he was kind of trying to see if how the assistant principal and the police liaison were handling the situation. In which case there was working with the student, trying to get him to talk about what had happened and then later.
Okay, so would this be student supervision or student discipline?
Student discipline.
Okay, so there's one descriptor that might fit, student discipline. But you're kind of wondering if maybe since the principal was just watching all this come down, if he was actually supervising the employee, in this case his AP.
Right.
Is that accurate?
Now that I'm thinking about it, I think I probably did put student supervision or student discipline because that's the content of the meeting, but that wasn't really what the principal was involved. He was not involved with it. He said absolutely nothing. And
I think the way you describe it, student discipline or employee supervision would fit. Anybody have another thought?
Well, Mark, if I think I heard that there was an officer there, if the officer was having, if the meeting was focused on him or her acquiring evidence, I'd be inclined to go with J. But you could also do a C if the principal was actually trying to see how the assistant was going to handle it.
Yeah,
I highlighted that was kind of a mental stretch. That was kind of my thought. That was another reason, I'm glad you brought that up, that it was tricky, is because with the police liaison, I mean, they have an office in the building, and it didn't seem right to consider this person external because they're there all day long working as a staff member.
And the way you just described it, I would agree with you. And so that's what's so interesting about the descriptors is you're going to find a lot of them would apply. And what you're looking at, which one is the most specific and is most accurate in terms of what's occurring. If what the principal was watching was the AP and the police officer talking with the student, trying to get the student to admit that he had this illegal substance, then I think student discipline is what it would be, because there's clearly a disciplinary piece implied here. But the other three, employee supervision, district, and external, could all fit as well. And so what you're looking for is what's the most specific that gives the most information for the principal in the end. Other questions or comments about this scenario? Other scenarios you'd like to talk before we go to the next piece of our training today? All right. Going to go back to the PowerPoint and see if I can find protocols. And it looks like my tech got ahead of me. There we go. On protocol, it's important that you try to arrive with the principal, and calling the night before or reporting up, asking what time the principal is expecting to arrive. That's important. You want to stay until the principal leaves for the first time after students have been dismissed. I know that's hard because it means that your day, instead of being 9 hours, could be 11 hours. But it's important that you follow the same protocol so we can compare this data from school to school. Silence is required. It's not a request, but it is an expectation. And I know this is hard as well. However, I would tell you that twice in the last 12 months we've had to redo data collection because the principal did not believe it was accurate, because the data collector did not follow this piece of the protocol. And so it's important to us that we stay silent. It's kind of interesting, the people who are online, I've heard such nice positive comments about almost all of you, I think all of you in fact, from schools, because you follow the protocol, and that's very important in terms of getting the principal to believe that the data is accurate. You try to avoid eye contact, and you try to be as nondescript as you can. I love the fact that several of you say you know you're successful if you're not remembered, and that's a good way of looking at it. Comments or questions about protocol? On ethics, just a reminder, you all sign an ethics agreement, and the reason that's important to us is we want the principal to feel comfortable about having you see things that he or she might not normally want people to see or hear. You're also reading over the principal's shoulder, reading what's on that BlackBerry so you can code accurately. And so that piece of ethics is very important to us that we follow. Questions or comments about protocol or ethics? All righty. Well, it is 2:56. We've gone almost our full hour. I've enjoyed talking with you today. It's hard to do when we have so much feedback, but I really appreciate how patient you have been. We will make this available as a recording, so people who weren't able to join us today can listen in. I want to thank you again for the work that you do. I cannot tell you enough how much principals value the work that you do. It's fascinating, and I know you'd all like to see it, to sit down with a principal and a SAM and say, here is your data. It is like you've given them a Christmas present, and they are so eager to open it, and then they spend a lengthy period of time talking about what it means. And it's really interesting to see that as part of the process, as the principal begins to think through, where do I want to be a month from now? Where do I want to be a year from now? And how am I going to do that? What am I going to change about my own practice? And frankly, none of that would happen without you, so hats off. I certainly appreciate your work and effort. Any other comments or questions before we close out today?
This has been very helpful.
I just thoroughly appreciate your work, guys. Thank you. Thank you all very much. I know some of you have heard that we are looking at trying a different way of collecting data using a tablet system using iPads, and we are still in development of that. We had hoped to be able to test it in November. It looks now like that testing is going to be pushed back because we're finding some problems with it. But when we're at that point, we'll be asking for volunteers, and we're going to do our first testing in Iowa, but we'll also be asking for volunteers later in other states to try out that system. But the intent is to just make it easier to process the data. And essentially, instead of the current system where you're carrying a clipboard, you'd carry a tablet. There'd be a clock built in, and every 5 minutes you'd get the question. Am I seeing something that's instruction, management, or personal? And you'd code, and then you'd continue coding as you move forward. Again, thank you, everyone, for participating.
Unmuted.
I'm sorry, did I hear something? I think just having people signing off again. Thanks, everyone, for participating. Look forward to seeing you all soon. Take care.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.